am Sounil Yu, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our webinar that will give you an inside look at how CISOs make decisions about their budgets and do risk assessments. I'm the CISO-in-Residence at Wildlife Ventures, an Israeli-American venture capital firm that does seed stage investments in Israeli security startups. And with me today, I have the honor of being joined by two distinguished guests, Stacey Halota and Bont. I will let them introduce themselves, and I'll start with Stacey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Stacey Halota. I'm the Vice President of Information Security and Privacy at Graham Holdings. Graham Holdings is a global company that's comprised of many different business units, including education, media, manufacturing, healthcare, restaurants, automotive, cybersecurity training, and social media advertising. My role at Graham Holdings is to direct the implementation of our information security and privacy programs.
Great, thanks, Stacey. And over to you, Ben.
Good day all, Ben Bont, the Chief Information Security Officer for the SaaS company ServiceNow. I'm based in Seattle. My current role is threefold. Firstly, securing ServiceNow and our customers. Secondly, assisting our sales teams on security-related conversations. And lastly, drinking our own champagne, as it were. We have our own security division at ServiceNow, and we use our own security products as part of our security program. And the third part of this role includes providing a continual feedback loop to our engineering and product teams on security feature improvements and suggestions. And I also play a role in identifying third-party security companies to which we integrate with our platform, occasionally startups that can become part of our security ecosystem to support our customers. Been in the fascinating domain of security for well over 20 years, leading a variety of different security teams across companies that include IBM, HP, MySpace, and Microsoft. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for all taking the time to dial into this lightning webinar.
All right, so let's go ahead and just jump right in. All right, so it seems like as soon as our fiscal year starts, we're already starting to plan for our next year's budget. Can you help the audience understand, give us a sense of the timeline for when the annual cybersecurity budgeting process begins and when it becomes mostly final? So we'll start with you, Stacey. Could you give us a sort of a view of what that looks like for you?
Absolutely. Well, in some ways it feels like it never ends, but normally, I start early in the year in March, just kind of planning out, looking at our plans and just, taking into account.
Actually, one quick question. When's your fiscal year?
Oh, it ends in December.
Okay, calendar year. Okay.
Yeah, calendar year. Just start planning it out. One thing about being in a holdings company is because the holdings company itself funds some of our initiatives, I need to do allocations actually before my budget is finalized, because they do their budgets prior to the corporate, which is all rolled up into one. So basically, I need to get my allocations out by August, and then my budget becomes finalized in the more November timeframe.
Got it. And how about you, Ben? When's your fiscal year, and how early in your fiscal year do you start?
Fiscal year is the same as Stacey, so ending in December. So given that security experiences such a fast rate of change, and at least in my experience, operations and execution often occurs in small cycles. So I think that annual budgeting is kind of a artifact of the past. And so what we do is we perform frequent small cycle budget reviews throughout the year. And so this allows us to walk into the more formal annual process with the most up-to-date and relevant information possible. It also enables agility and flexibility to pivot in unexpected situations. So that could be a security incident, it could be a board-sponsored security program, could be customer asks, or dealing with global events like COVID-19.
Got it, thanks. By the way, we're going to go rapid fire through a lot of questions, but if the audience has any questions that they want to ask, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll go systematically through as many questions as we can. So question back to you now, Stacey. What sort of, give me a sense of the process that you go through to build that budget. How do you prioritize and rack and stack projects and initiatives?
Sure. So we have company risk assessments that we go through. We have company-wide plans. So basically every company kind of lays out, this is, the major initiatives that we have if we're going to migrate to a new system. I look at our merger and acquisition activity. I talk regularly to all the business units. And because our business units operate in a completely decentralized mode. So basically, I reach out to them, talk to the leadership at each company just to make sure that I understand what's happening. And like Ben, we also kind of try to plan in for a buffer because things do come up during the year. And, that we might, want to do a rapid pilot or, do something that wasn't planned. But that's the general process.
Okay, great. Ben, there was a follow-up question that we had for you in terms of how often are these reviews that you do throughout the year, and at what point can we actually secure an earmark in the budgeting process?
Actually, just answered that in the chat for the first part of the question, which is on a monthly basis with several hours spent on a minimum each quarter, as much as needed to unpack the security budget and to work out whatever has occurred recently. In regards to an earmark, I would recommend that attempts to earmark a part of the process is not done at the end of the year. To me, it's better off if it's done so as a kickoff in, say, Q1, when everybody's all motivated to jump into their role at the start of the year. Other than that, it really depends on what happens throughout the year, given those events that I described, whether it's security incidents, whether there's particular events. It could be in lieu of our annual customer event. These are usually good occasions to engage with various startups and get them a seat in that budgeting process.
Okay, great, thanks. With respect to the budgeting process, oftentimes we end up with projects that fall below the line. So Stacey, can you give us a perspective of what you do when an important project, but maybe it's not urgent at the time, when they fall below the line? What do you do at that point?
Absolutely. We keep them kind of in mind, and because our company can change pretty rapidly, do kind of a monthly assessment and determine if something can be slotted in, or consider, maybe getting, extra help. In some cases too, it's nice because even though the companies operate independently, they do assist each other. So, where one company might have a project, they might reach out to another and basically ask, do you have resources on your end to help us, to do this? It doesn't happen a huge amount, but, it does happen. And it's just nice to be able to pull, the knowledge and resources from other parts of the company.
Got it. And how much room do you have for discretionary spending? And do you have, how do you allocate or handle that discretionary spending throughout the year? Ben, maybe you can chime in on that, as well as Stacey.
Oh, sure. So basically, from a discretionary spending point, I do have a small, earmark for that. And at the corporate level, there's a pool as well that's held, just because of the nature of being a holdings company. We look for example, there's M&A activity that might take place during the year, so you're never quite sure how much that's going to cost. So I do have a small amount for that. And we do, research and development. And so, there is a pool, and that's where I would bring in a startup basically to do a pilot. A lot of times we'll do a pilot at the corporate office just because we're so small that we can basically bring somebody in, we can kind of get the paperwork finished, go through legal and get a pilot up and running and kind of, kick the tires of something and then make that recommendation to our broader business unit base.
Okay.
Adding to that, we at ServiceNow, most of our increase in spending is due to scale and growth. We do leave discretionary budget for initiatives such as bug bounties, third-party attestations. There's a lot of desire for concept of a slush fund, but we discourage this a great deal to try to be as accurate as possible as we can in the budgeting cycles. But there is the discretionary funds mostly targeted for crisis situations or the unexpected, and we expect the unexpected to occur multiple times throughout a year. But we try to keep the costs as accurate as we can, but we always do have a little bit there to spend on something as we see the need to, based upon events throughout the year.
So Ben, as a follow-up to that, what would be a good way that a startup could approach you cold? If there's not a warm handoff of any sort, what's the best way that they can approach you cold to be included for consideration?
Yeah, that's a great question. The usual reaction to security vendors and products is hitting the delete key when I receive an email from them. So usually the new tech that's considered is entertained and based upon trusted word of mouth, whether it's by colleagues or partners or due to a meeting at a conference, whether it's virtual or physical. That's what I'd see as the first step. Step two is value to the company. Confidence that the startup's vision and approach solves a real security problem that we're facing. And so of the hundreds of security startups that we see each year, all of them, without exception, state innovative or groundbreaking new approaches or advancements in technology. So there is no lack of hyperbole in security sales, and often the more exaggerated the claim, the less we're interested in the product. So what is often lacking is compelling data on derived business value, whether it's to drive down risk, to increase operating effectiveness, to introduce greater levels of automation, etc. So quantitative metrics, use cases, or business results where real improvements have been executed is of great interest. And finally, I'd say step three would be the value add against competitors. So once a startup has established that they're worthy of consideration, they need to be able to contrast themselves against their competitors' offerings. This can be done by highlighting effectiveness, cost, manageability, or the ease and quality of integration into our existing ecosystem.
So one of the things you mentioned was the use of risk assessments to understand what products to consider. So I heard Ben, you mentioning that. Stacey, how about you? How do you use risk assessments to play into your decision making regarding what you put into your security stack? Is there any, and to really both of you as well, do you any sort of quantitative risk assessment to be able to justify that budget or make a case for more funding?
Sure.
So Stacey.
Yeah, we absolutely do risk assessments across the company, and they do play into what we look at from a security product perspective. The other thing that we do is we do business impact analysis. So we have an idea and we do those, we get those refreshed on a regular basis, at least yearly, just so that we always kind of keep front and center, here's kind of, the value, these systems, what they process, and, the amount of revenue that goes through them, the type of data that is processed, just to kind of keep things in perspective as far as, those systems. And that does drive our decision-making process. The other thing that we do that's important is we look at the regulatory landscape because, as a company, we're global. We're touched by things like GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act, HIPAA. Yeah, I mean, there's all different types of regs that we need to remain aware of. And because planning for those, and they do intersect with the information security world, that is a big deal for some of these. Just to make sure that you have, kind of taking your existing processes, which mostly are in place to address them, but just making sure that, if they need to be refined or streamlined, that they can be, but just, or, changes in the PCI standard. So all that gets factored in to the planning.
How about you, Ben?
What Stacey said, but
okay.
Risk assessments certainly are a major contributor to budget decision making, more so in identifying and determining the priority of the work that we're about to embark upon.
There was something else that Stacey mentioned that actually came in as a question around how much does regulation drive our decisions and what we choose. So I think I heard from Stacey that it's a pretty major factor. But is that what is your all's view in terms of how often does it actually end up driving the decision of having to get a product or choosing a product?
I don't know. One thing I was thinking of, and this would be an opportunity for startups, is when a regulation comes along, and I was thinking of Sarbanes-Oxley or, GDPR, even though GDPR was really replacing, an existing reg, those are opportunities in some cases where companies might be looking, to slightly new processes, and, they might be tracking things or doing things in, I think in the early Sarbanes-Oxley days, a lot of companies start off with spreadsheets, and then you see kind of an opportunity for startups to come in and basically, bring in technology to basically address a new regulation in kind of a big way. So I think that that's something, just for startups, you're not going to create a whole product around one regulation, most of the time. But you might look at one thing I'm thinking of is as the United States is really turning with the California Consumer Privacy Act more, to a GDPR-like privacy model, that there might be opportunities there to help companies just with streamlining things like their subject access requests for data access and deletion. So, those can bring opportunity.
Okay. Ben, another question for you then. And with respect to the regulatory environment, there's other things that are also happening in the world that's driving decisions that we make on our budget. So can you give us a perspective of how recent events have impacted your budget and your particular priorities?
Yeah, sure thing, Sounil. So it seems that most businesses are taking revenue hits in some form or another, and this is resulting in the elimination or trimming of existing spends. This can include non-renewal or termination of contractor engagements. It could include pushing the sales cycle back a quarter or two, renegotiation of contract terms, or the delay or elimination of new headcount allocations, or pushing out new headcount by a quarter or two in a similar fashion. Conducted a number of CISO roundtables with our customers, and some companies have taken pay cuts across the board. Others have sent a percentage of their workforce home without pay for a certain period of time. And there has been a general expectation that operating costs will be reduced. So many companies are looking for increased efficiencies and opportunities that may not have been acted upon in the past. An example could be that security and IT operations teams may pool their resources or their operating processes to enable an alignment around 24/7 response. Review of security product portfolios are common. I know that I'm doing one. I was doing one before this recent event, but it's with even more scrutiny now. So those products that aren't providing clear business value are sometimes being stripped, whereas those products that can reduce costs, introduce automation, or replace the human element may see increased investments. And so the approach we're taking is looking at our existing products and new products and seeing what the clear business value is provided by those products. And if there's something that will improve our operating costs in the future or efficiencies, then it's certainly taken into consideration.
So for those new products, it's a question for you, Stacey. Give me a sense of what would cause you to choose a new product over a product from a new company versus one from a well-established one?
Sure. Well, we've done that before with several times. One of the things that I like, and we have partnerships with big companies, but I like forming a partnership with a startup and basically being able to give feedback into a product, where we might have, requirements. I like, in some cases, there might be an advantage from a cost perspective if you work with a startup company where you could get, pricing advantage, for a company. But I do like that partnership aspect, and we have in the past partnered and given a lot of input into some of the products that we use. So that is really I find that to be just a good plan for our company.
What I like too, Stacey, is that startups can offer have the agility and the willingness to be flexible to pivot for the environment in which they're discussing. Or even in unexpected situations. And so that is a particular interest. Most of the more established security products or security companies may commit to doing this, but the results I find are far more impactful by those smaller early stage startups.
And I think too, just to add, one thing that we find is that our pilots tend to be extended, but when we choose a vendor, we tend to stay with them for quite some time. And I think a startup is more inclined to work with us on our pilot because, we have a lot of things going on, and sometimes it's hard for us to complete a pilot in, what a larger company would want us to complete it in. So that flexibility is also helpful.
And let me add to that just a little bit further, Stacey. What I like about startups is a lot of the more established or larger security companies in organizations like ours that continue to see rapid growth, the licensing costs and fees become astronomical. And so there is always the consideration of, well, I'm sick of paying this 30% increase year over year, and then the vendor's not really budging on the actual costs in a reasonable fashion. So in the back of my mind is, well, is there the opportunity to strip them out for an open source solution that we build ourselves, or to go with an early stage startup that can provide similar levels of features and functionality at a fraction of the cost?
So one of the things I heard is this notion that we have to that we want vendors to be able to adapt to the changing conditions. And one of the things that we're seeing, of course, with work from home is new vectors that are coming in. Have you seen actually any particular startups that have adjusted, that maybe are using threat intelligence as a way to really drive the things that they think you need, and then adjusting accordingly to be able to deliver the products that you need to be able to accommodate the new environment that we're dealing with?
I think one of the things that I've seen is that vendors that we work with already are reaching out to offer more service for free, and more coverage if we want it. And, we work with a company that does basically risk rating, with external data. So they're outside your company, and they've offered, to extend that, to cover all of our vendors. So, companies that do, advanced malware detection have offered to cover all of your employees' home devices. So I think, just reaching out and really that, also shows, the extent of just the partnerships, and, makes me value those vendors so much, because they are reaching out in this time and just saying, we'll just cover you, and you don't even have to buy it next year. Just, we'll give you additional.
And to that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, never waste a good crisis. We're all in security.
That's right.
We're all in security. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality. Yeah. If a startup can take advantage of any crisis or unexpected situation, there is great business opportunity. We mentioned regulations before. GDPR, those companies that immediately produced GDPR training or guidelines or made it easier for companies, got a bunch of cash. They had some of them had some very successful business models. So if you have your startup and you're ready to pivot, no matter what the global situation is, there is often business opportunity that can be found. And seeing that sort of innovation, and again, that level of agility is very appealing, and will help engage or take you to that next level of conversation to get a foothold within an organization.
Yeah. By the way, so for the folks who are attending, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into Q&A. We've already gotten a few. I wanted to follow up with one of the comments you made earlier in terms of how to make the introduction, how to make a cold introduction, and oftentimes it's hard to do if you're an unknown party. But I think this notion of offering products for free, especially during this time, it seems like it's a common course of action that many companies are doing to make it easier to adapt to some of the budget crunches that people may be facing, but really as a way to get people to try your product. So it's something that's happened in the past, or is there something different about what we're seeing now that makes it more attractive, or makes it more of an approach, makes it more approachable in terms of being able to adopt a particular technology?
I don't know if I'm that sold on the concept. Maybe to gain that foothold, that introduction, hey, we'll do a POC for free. But if the product is providing real business value, then we don't mind paying for it. The issue is around integration and how that product would coexist with the current security portfolio. There are so many security endpoint solutions, security products out there. An organization that's worked out a way for all of them to play nicely and work perfectly together is an organization that I've not experienced yet. So that integration piece is key. That's more important to me than whether the product is free or not. Hey, look, this product's going to provide a great deal of value. Here's how we can prove it. Here's use cases as an example for how we've done this in the past. And by the way, it's going to integrate really well with your current ecosystem. And this is how more appealing to me than it's free.
Great. A few more questions that are rolling in before we wrap up. So one of them is something that I've had to deal with many times. So how do y'all partner with purchasing or the procurement department when it comes to vendors, in particular new vendors in new categories that may not previously exist and there's not a line item for? How do you partner with your purchasing department? How should the vendor interact with them?
So basically, just because we're a holding company, I think our experience is a little bit different because it's a very streamlined process at the corporate office level. Probably the most difficult part is the legal review of the contract. But from a procurement perspective, it's extremely streamlined, and I would basically be the kind of interacting somebody on my team with the vendor and our purchasing department. Once we get into the other companies, it can be a little bit more cumbersome, it takes a little bit more time. But the legal review that takes place at corporate is probably the most time consuming. And once that's finished, then it's definitely more of a streamlined process.
Let me add to that. Security, a lot of what security is about is relationships. I'm sure that's very similar to many of you that are listening, to sell your products. So those relationships that are often key in getting that next step. Similarly, internally, trying to drive security work in an organization and across your customer base, it's also based upon relationships. In regards to procurement, what I do is I develop a relationship with key people on the procurement team ahead of time, asking them about their role, what they enjoy doing. Develop that rapport, so then when interesting security items come up, it makes that conversation so much easier. The same with legal, same with any other department in the company.
All right, so 2 more questions to wrap up. One is, vendors oftentimes, so one of the things that we want to be able to get from vendors is something that helps us justify a purchase decision. So vendors oftentimes try to measure risk reduction as a way to demonstrate ROI. How believable is that to you guys? How believable is some sort of risk reduction metric? How useful would it be to you if a vendor came to you with that sort of value, or that sort of measurement, I should say?
Dig into the metric, use cases, competitive assessment. I think it's important to have quantitative metrics, but also a qualitative element as well. I don't want a security vendor to keep telling me about the problem, or hey, this is a new problem, or here's a new aspect of a problem that exists. I want them to tell me about the solution they have to a known security issue that's common. Most of the security issues that exist today are the same security issues that existed 3 decades ago. And so as I look at these metrics that are provided, I think about what is the greater problem that's trying to be solved. And if they can provide that solution-orientated approach rather than just harping on about the problem, then it's a lot more effective. So metrics that show how they've solved it, but upon close scrutiny, they stand up. And you'd think that they always do, but in many cases, I find that once you dig in deeply, there's less substance to those metrics than one might expect.
I agree, and I think it's hard for a startup to develop those metrics. I think it's more useful for us to look at our internal metrics and how this product would apply to those, and then do our own analysis.
Okay, so the last question, which we'll wrap up with, is: have you seen any new strategies that you see working that are coming from sales folks? So if there's someone's trying to sell you something new, what type of strategies have you seen work the best? What new types of strategies have you seen work the best?
Well, it was an interesting one I got the other day where they had Zoom-based golf lessons, which I thought was interesting.
Okay.
But as for strategies, it really comes back to relationships and showing the business, the value add, taking advantage of a crisis situation if the angle is in selling a startup. I don't know, Stacey, what have you seen?
I haven't really seen a huge amount of new things. I do get a lot. One thing that I was really grateful to see is I had been working with a privacy vendor for training, and I really wanted to buy it, but it's just so many other things going on. But it actually they partnered with a vendor that I already had licenses for. So that was awesome. The other thing too, I would want to just kind of throw out there, and this is from my days working with the Big Four, is don't ignore the audit crowd as a startup, as a security startup, because even though, they might not be the direct audience, they do have a lot of influence. And I'm thinking, of internal auditors, and there might even be speaking opportunities for you in those forums where you could speak to a group of internal auditors who then speak to their chief security officer. So, and also in privacy forums, they're always looking for information security speakers. So, there are other forums that you can explore outside of the traditional information security world that might give you and also look, I'm just going to do a shout out for Wild Ventures. When I'm looking for a startup, I want to save time, I want to reduce risk, I want to be more efficient. And when you look at the companies that YL has invested in, that to me is kind of a playbook, of here are companies that are useful, and here are companies that do that. And I just think that it's a great example that you can learn from.
Thanks. So we need to wrap up, and there's so many points that we made that I just want to be able to review as takeaways. For those who are watching online, we're also going to have this recorded and we'll post the links to it later. But just to wrap up the different responses that we got, let me just summarize them. So we have different companies have different ways that we do budgeting and different life cycles. So that so if you're a startup and you want to try to ensure that you have a slot in the budget, it's important to take time to understand how your particular the prospect that you're dealing with differs from one vertical to another on a general scale, and customers to make sure that you're targeting that specific customer set and understanding their cycles, if you will. With respect to how to engage, cold calls don't work well. Random emails don't work well. Try to get an in-person referral. Try to get data that helps support your claims. Don't make overly inflated claims. That usually doesn't go well either. Make sure that your value propositions are very transparent and very clear and highlight your competitive advantage. As far as decision-making factors, regulations definitely factor in. Compliance-driven things, unfortunately, do drive our purchasing decisions. But ultimately, we're trying to do a risk management type of approach, and so we try to factor in risk as much as possible. And then as far as given the budget crunches that we have, it's great that people are offering products for free, but that's not the only thing that's going to really sell at the end of the day. So it's a great way to get a foothold for sure, but let's make sure that at the end of the day, even trying something for free takes up time on our end. So we got to make sure that the value is pretty clear from the time that we commit. So with that, thank you very much, Stacey. Thank you very much, Ben. We're out of time, and we appreciate you participating in this webinar.